Morning guys, welcome back to the channel. And in this video I'm going to look at using shutter speeds creatively for wildlife photography. And I guess the first question we need to ask is, do we always need a fast shutter speed to freeze the motion of the animal we're photographing? And of course the answer to that question is no. Sometimes, yes, we want to freeze the motion of the animal, many times in actual fact, but sometimes we can use a slow shutter speed to create intentional movement, to add a bit of energy and a sense of speed to that photograph. So when it comes to picking the right shutter speed, there's no hard or fast rules, or there's no one shutter speed fits all occasions, because there's lots of variables. And of course the first one is the speed of the animal we're photographing. The faster that animal's moving, the faster the shutter speed would need to be to freeze the motion, and you don't need such a fast shutter speed to blur it if it's moving really quickly. So speed of the subject's really important. Then there are another couple of factors actually. The next one will be the direction. If something's moving towards us, so if that animal is running or flying towards us, it won't appear to be moving as quickly than as if it's flying across the frame or across the lens. So if it's going across the lens, we wouldn't need such a such a slow shutter speed to blur that motion, because it would look as if it's moving more quickly. And of course we'd need a faster shutter speed to freeze the motion if it's going across the lens than if it was coming towards us. And then the third one is how big in the frame that animal is. If it's really big in the frame, so if you're close to it or you're using a long lens and that animal is big in the frame, it will appear to be moving more quickly. So you have to work out the shutter speed that we need in order to freeze the motion or blur the motion, depending on those variables. If we look at this sequence of pictures, it's of a fallow deer, and I shot this at a very slow shutter speed, 1/15 of a second, and I'm panning with the movement of the animal. So I've got the camera here and I'm panning the camera round, so I'm moving and keeping the animal in roughly the same part of the frame as it moves through that exposure. And it's a 1/15 of a second exposure. Now this is quite slow, and to be honest it's created way too much image blur. What we want is some blur, but we want to still be able to recognise the animal and put it in its context. So the idea of panning with a slow shutter speed is to create lots of movement in the background particularly, so you get this really blurred background and it gives the impression of speed. But in this case we've got a very blurred background, but the subject is too blurred. So a 15th of a second in this case is too long, and we need to readjust. Incidentally, in order to get that 15th of a second, I needed to stop the lens right down. So I'm using a very big f number, so there's not very much light coming through the lens, which means I can use a much slower shutter speed in natural lighting conditions. And I'm also shooting with a really low ISO number to make the camera as least sensitive to light as possible, again to enable that slow shutter speed in normal lighting conditions. In this next series of pictures I'm shooting at 1/30th of a second, so the shutter speed's a bit faster, which means we're reducing some of the image blur, and I think this is a better interpretation of the subject. I still don't think it's the final shot, but you can see there's still plenty of movement in the background, which creates that sense of speed and energy, and we can basically make out what the subject is now. We can certainly see it's a deer, and we can probably work out that it's a fallow deer if you know what a fallow deer is. But again, because the animal's moving quite quickly, so I'm panning across the frame quite quickly, I think there's still too much blur in this shot. So it's about finding the optimum shutter speed to create exactly the right amount of blur we want for this image. As I say, these three pictures were taken at 1/30th of a second exposure, and you can see there's a really different amount of blurred motion in each one, and that's of course because the animals are moving at different speeds. If the animal is moving fast, I'm needing to pan with that motion much more quickly, and that creates more blur. And if you look at this last shot, this fallow deer is literally just slowly trotting along, so I'm moving the camera less quickly, which creates less blur. So the speed of the subject is of course vitally important when it comes to the amount of blur you're getting in your pictures. This last sequence of images I think are about right, and I'm shooting this at a 60th of a second, and again I'm panning with the movement of the animal, and I think this is a good compromise. we've got a nice bit of movement in the background, so we can still see or get an impression of speed, but we can really make out this animal's features now. Now, of course, when you're using a slower shutter speed and you're panning with a fast moving animal, it's never going to be completely sharp, and that's okay. We're not looking for a pin sharp image. What we're looking to do is to give an impression of speed, and I think with this shot at 60th of a second, f29, ISO 64, gives us about the right balance between making out what the features of the subject, what the subject is, and giving an impression of movement and speed. So I think this would be the picture I would pick to use. So 60th of a second works about right for this subject, but again, it won't work for every subject because it will depend on how close the animal is, as I say, and how fast it's moving and what direction it's moving in. If we look at these next two pictures of avocets, these were taken with a fast shutter speed actually, 1/800th of a second. But because the avocets were either coming into land or taking off, they were flapping their wings incredibly quickly. So what we've got here, again, is a little bit of blurred movement, but we've got a much sharper part of the subject. So the head and the body, and particularly the eye of the avocet, is sharp, but just the wingtips are a bit blurred. And again, I think this is a really nice effect because we've got a sharp main part of our subject with a little bit of image blur on those fast flapping wings, which gives again a sense of movement and a sense of how fast these wings are flapping. So I think an 800th of a second was a really good shutter speed for this subject. Now, I could have shot with maybe a 2000th or a 3000th of a second, and that would have totally frozen the movement of not just the bird, the head, the body, but the wings as well. But I feel that that little bit of movement in the wings really adds to this image. So again, it's not always about going for a really slow shutter speed, you know, the 15th, the 30th or the 60th of a second that we've already looked at. In this case, much faster shutter speed, 1/800th of a second, but it still produced a little bit of movement in our subject, in this case the avocet, and I think that's a really good thing. We've got a couple of pictures of gannets coming up now, and I was shooting with a much slower shutter speed again, a 15th of a second. And the reason they're not totally blurred, like in the pictures of the fallow deer at the beginning, is because the gannets are hovering, so they're a lot more static. They're not flying across the frame, they're right in front of me and they're just hovering, which means as their wings are flapping, we're getting all the movement of the wings flapping, and with a bit of movement in the body because it isn't stationary, but we can certainly see it's a gannet. So I think having a slower shutter speed here gives us a really nice sense of movement as that gannet's hovering. I've also got lots of pictures of gannets with fast shutter speeds, but I felt actually this worked really well. And the second thing was, it was a really cloudy day and the light levels were low and there wasn't any contrast, so I felt that going for a more sort of artistic representation of the gannets this time worked really well. So we've got the movement in the wings, we've got a bit of movement in the body, the light's really flat, but that doesn't matter, and it's a 15th of a second, around about f16, ISO I think 64 or maybe 100. So a small aperture again, and a low ISO number so that we can have a slow shutter speed in not bright conditions but certainly daylight conditions. I just wanted to finish this video off with a couple of pictures using a fast shutter speed, which is what we'd normally do for wildlife photography. So if you look at the pictures of these ospreys, these images were shot at 1/1250th of a second, so fast enough to freeze most of the motion of the bird. Now again, because the wings are flapping really quickly as it's coming out of the water, you've still got maybe a tiny little bit of blur at the tips of the wings. And as I say, I think that's okay, I think that's fine, as long as the main subject is sharp, the eyes are sharp in this case. But it's a fast shutter speed, I'm shooting at f6.7, ISO 400, and that gave me a fast enough shutter speed to freeze basically the motion of this animal. Last but not least, we've got a picture of a hobby, and I think hobbies are fantastic birds of prey. They're really quick, so we need, if we're going to freeze the motion of these animals, we need a fast shutter speed. They hunt dragonflies, and they're very manoeuvrable. So with this hobby, I was shooting with a really fast shutter speed, and I think the shutter speed was 1/4000th of a second. The ISO was ISO 400, and the camera was at round about, again, f5.6. I think I was wide open because I wanted a really fast shutter speed to freeze the motion of the animal. And you can see it's bang, it's very sharp on the eye, there's no movement in the eye, there's no movement on the wingtips, there's no movement in the body. So this would be your more traditional shutter speed, wouldn't it? Fast shutter speed to avoid camera shake and freeze the subject of the animal you're photographing. But as we've seen, you don't always have to restrict yourself to a fast shutter speed. Slow shutter speed can be incredibly creative. Now, the images won't be as sharp, obviously, but we're not going for that. We're going for a more artistic or creative impression of the thing, the animal we're photographing. So, a creative use of shutter speed. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have enjoyed it, and you haven't already subscribed to my channel, if you can consider subscribing, that would be brilliant. The more, the merrier. And if you can give it a like, a thumbs up, that would be brilliant. Oh yeah, if you do subscribe, if you press the bell notification icon, hopefully YouTube will tell you when my next video is uploaded. And then last but not least, if you've got any experiences of using slow shutter speeds for wildlife photography, let me know. Drop them in, and they were successful particularly, drop them in the comments section below. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll speak to you on my next one. So bye for now.